countries come, and how that differs from the value system that governs these three universal urges: violence, sex, and money.
But you write very movingly in your book about how you were reunited with your father and what happened when you went to visit him in hospital on his deathbed, and you had to, in effect, bridge the gap between your two worlds.
Yes, and I think the first bit is the universal relationship between a parent and a child, and then the difference in outlook on life, the way my father viewed life and viewed death and viewed what would come after death is very different from how I have come to view it, and that made him very, very sad, and it took him to a point where he didn't want to talk to me. But fortunately, I think human love and affection and parenthood transcended that, and I was able to be at the hospital. I was able to hold his hand, but our ideas were not reconciled.
Isn't that the answer, though, to many of your criticisms of Islam, that he was a very devout Muslim and he had grave reservations about what you did, the way you lived your life, but in the end, he was your father, and that was more important than anything that Allah might be saying to him. He was able to grasp your hand.
Yes, but when I talk about the opportunities that thousands of girls are denied to go to school, to choose their own mates, are subjected to violence, and it's done in the name of the moral framework that my father taught me, it obliges me not only for me to run away from that and emancipate myself from those reactionary ideas and practices, but also to speak up for those left behind, unless you want me to shut up about it.
No, I mean, how did in the end, how did it affect you, though, that your father was never able to forgive you for what you did?
I think we should move away from psychologizing it. I think we should cut the therapy short and look at the facts. Look at the fact
but
that
personal experience always affects a person's outlook.
Personal experience affects one's outlook, but personal experience backed by facts and by the data that I have just given you, that we cannot pick up any newspaper today and you will see some form of violence justified in the name of Islam that affects mostly Muslims. Muslim women, Muslim men, Muslim populations. The number of deaths I just told you about affected Muslims first and foremost. And I think that we have to rearrange our priorities and get away from defending the image of Islam and get to really defending human rights.
Well, you made, of course, that very controversial film to highlight a lot of these issues, particularly about what you say happens to women in Islam. You had an image of a half-naked woman depicted with lash marks on her back, whilst passages from the Quran were read. Can you understand why many Muslims thought that film was highly insulting and very provocative?
I don't. I wish that those... I'll tell you why. I wish that those Muslims would read that verse on that half-naked body that says, flog the adulterer and the adulteress 100 times. Let there be witnesses and let no compassion move you. That, the flogging that takes place in Iran, in Saudi Arabia, in Afghanistan, and behind closed doors and closed curtains in the UK and in the United States, and affects so many women, that Muslim men and women who are appalled by that half-naked body would look into the content of that verse and how it's applied in practice to so many human beings, That is what surprises me, that they are not looking at that. They're not looking at the content of the verses in the film submission.
As a result of that film, you had death threats. What's your life like today? You live in the shadow of those death threats, presumably.
Well, the idea behind the death threats is you made that film, and before that you spoke about these things. We are going to kill you. That is a compelling argument. It is appeal to force. And we know from human history that if you succumb to that kind of argument, the dark forces will reign. And I have lived, and here comes again experience, in countries where dark forces reign and where the appeal to force is applied every day. And I just want to continue and show those of us who live in freedom and beg and plead and appeal, please, let's not succumb to that argument.
But everywhere you go now, presumably you have to have bodyguards.
I have protection, and it's the sensible thing to do.
Well, despite all that, you've continued, of course, campaigning for the rights of Muslim women. And in your book, you say, Islam imbues a system of values in which women have little more free will than livestock.
Absolutely. And the assumption I have in doing this and repeating it over and over again is that human beings, even those born into Islam, are capable of changing their mind if they're confronted with different facts and if they're confronted with better, superior moral frameworks.
But that, that's very simplistic, isn't it? You only have to go to modern Muslim countries like Turkey to see women often, particularly in cities like Istanbul, enjoying exactly the same rights as their Christian counterparts. They wouldn't recognize that image of what happens to Muslim women.
If you go to the Turkish countryside, and if you have been following events in Turkey, say, for the last 10 years, what you see is a strengthening and a growing of the Islamist movement that has Muslim women behind veils. And most Turkish women who are now subjected to that growing movement, as in Egypt, for instance, or even Indonesia, these are places that were generally more liberal than Saudi Arabia. What you see is that once the Islamic Brotherhood gets their hold on societies, that the rights of these women also begin to recede.
What makes Islam any different to a literal reading of Christian or Jewish teaching? I mean, even in your own book, you admit that Islam doesn't have a monopoly on misogyny. You say that contempt for women is inscribed in the works of St. Paul.
It is, and what I've also discovered living here in the West is that the Jewish people and Christian peoples have spent centuries revising and reforming and reviewing their religions and their concepts of God. The concept of God of the mainstream Christian is all about love and fatherhood. They have practically abolished hell. Muslims, progressive Muslims, have also made attempts to reform and revise their religion and have always met with a great deal of violence that stifled and shut down any kind of progress. And that's what I'm pointing to. I'm not saying that all Muslims are a monolith and they are not progressive, but the progressive forces are silenced.
But Muslim scholars spend an awful lot of time debating the meaning of Islam and exactly where the religion should be going. They're having this debate. They're trying to modernize their religion.
And those who are proponents of progress and reform and revision live with bodyguards, use aliases, have been killed or jailed or tortured, and are always and have always for centuries been in the minority. That is a fact that those of us who were brought into Islam cannot escape. We need to reform and revise the teachings of Muhammad, and we need to move away from the literal meaning of the Quran. And that is something that mainstream Muslims have not done, but mainstream Christians and mainstream Jews have done that.
And you think, actually, the mainstream Christian church has a role, don't you, in trying to, as you put it, open up the Muslim mind. You say Islam's fatally flawed. I think there's a much more direct way of opening the Muslim mind than by reinterpreting the Quran so as to tone it down. How does Christianity come into this? What role do you think can the Christian church play?
Well, I was thinking of a form of spiritual capitalism, given the demography of Muslims who are all God-seeking. After I wrote Infidel, I got some letters from Muslims who say, I relate to you and I completely agree with what you say about Islam, but I do not want to be an atheist. And they have become Christians. And I thought this is a wonderful opportunity for mainstream moderate Christianity to compete with the Wahhabis for the hearts and minds of Muslims, starting with those who are living in the West.
Do you honestly think, though, that if you send some sort of Christian priest along to a Muslim place of worship and say, I want to convert you, in effect, I can lead you to the promised land, that people are going to say, yes, that's absolutely right, I'm going to abandon my religion? That seems highly unlikely.
Well, I was thinking of more sophisticated and more persuasive means of doing that. And if you look at how the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, goes into these neighborhoods, they start saying, hey, we'll build you a mosque, we'll talk to you. Have you been reading the Quran? Do you call yourself a Muslim and you're not covering? Here is a text for you to read. Here, visit this website. There are there are ways of talking to people and persuading people and penetrating communities, and I think that the Christian church has a history of doing it and doing it very well. It's just not doing it now.
All right, well, you reserve a lot of your criticism for multiculturalism. What's wrong with it, in your eyes?
It's the idea that all cultures and all religions are equal, But above all, it's also the idea that in a liberal society, if minorities bring about practices that are inhuman and that violate human rights, we should look away from that in the argument of using the argument that it's their culture that justifies it and it's their religion that justifies it. And I'm talking about practices such as female genital mutilation. I have given the example of Germaine Greer comparing it to wearing high-heeled shoes and says, well, it's their way of doing it, it's their cultures. She's asked in Australia about it by a human rights activist, by a journalist about honor killings, and also dismisses condemning honor killings as, you know, it's their culture. You know, that's something that you can justify in their culture.
Isn't that an extreme view of multiculturalism, though? I mean, multiculturalism can mean many things, and there's plenty of evidence you can be a good Muslim and a good member of Western society. For example, a Gallup survey of interfaith relations in Britain says 77% of British Muslims identify very strongly with their country. 82% of them would prefer not to live in a neighbourhood made up mostly of people of their own ethnic or religious background. And 98% of British Muslims believe honour killings are morally wrong. They seem to be able to balance their religion with integrating in society.
I think all these Gallup polls and Pew polls that show, if you look at the last, at least the last 5 or 6 years, you see numbers that are completely the opposite of that, don't tell us enough about the girls who are pulled out of school, the girl who is suffocated by her father, the girl who is run down by her father, the girl who is, you know, I really understand this, and I think, and I wish that we could get to a point where Muslims become really, truly British, truly American in their values, but right now we are not there, regardless of these cooked-up statistics.
What's the difference to multiculturalism? What's the other approach that you would recommend to multiculturalism then? What's the other way forward for many Western societies?
It is to look at that binds all humanity first and foremost, and that is the individual human being, not cultures, not groups. And any group using the argument of culture or whatever that takes away the rights or freedoms, or attempts to do that, should be stopped in their tracks, whether they are Muslims, Christians, Jews, or something else. My problem with multiculturalism is there is an emphasis on protecting groups and cultures, and there is a weakness and a complacency and a laziness toward protecting the rights of individuals.
Well, one of your critics, Ian Baruma, says that a free-spirited citizen doesn't tolerate different customs or cultures because he thinks they're wonderful, but because he believes in freedom. In other words, you're in danger of practicing the same intolerance that you accuse Islam of pursuing.
I am intolerant of honor killings. I'm intolerant of female genital mutilation. I'm intolerant of jihad, holy war against infidels. I am intolerant of the idea that if one leaves Islam, one must be killed. I am truly and passionately and openly and clearly intolerant of all of that. Where does Mr. Baruma stand on these things?
But when you read your book, it sounds as though you're intolerant on most aspects of Islam. There is no room, or very little room, for manoeuvre in your thoughts. It is, in the words of one critic, an oversimplistic analysis.
Well, if you read my book properly, you will see that I say all these arguments for prayer, fasting, hospitality, and charity, that is fine. I don't even think that's under discussion. This is irrelevant to the discussion. The debate we are having that started for me after the 11th of September, but was ongoing in Europe and in the Muslim world before that, was all forms of violence and intolerance that is perpetrated in the name of Islam. The movement that wants to have parts of Sharia introduced into Western countries, such as the UK, the lobbies here in the United States that want family law, the part of Sharia family law, I'm intolerant of that.
We get the message. Ayaan Hirsi, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Hard Talk.
Thank you very much for having me.